Welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Have your coffee, Sarah?
I have a full mug of coffee right here. I'm very excited.
I know I've got my favorite octopus mug.
I love it. I have a Friends of Casco Bay mug. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. As you can see, we have a slide up with two photos taken during the recent storms we had here in Maine. And we want you to guess where these photos are. So you can just throw your guesses in the chat and we'll let you know a little later. Ivy, what are you drinking? Do you have coffee?
Yes, I for those of you who don't know my coffee drinking habits, I always drink half decaf, and as some of my colleagues know, no one ever wants to see me fully caffeinated.
Yeah, we were debating whether to drink coffee or tea this morning. We didn't want to be too hyper on this, but we are both drinking coffee, so you're welcome.
We were just stunned by all the water reporter photos and other photos that people sent us from around our watershed. And even if it was like places that we knew, they look so different covered in water. So some of the places, even though we go to them all the time, just look so vastly different.
Now, let me tell you that in the first photo, a few days ago, I showed Ivy this photo and I
Oh
said,
no, you're
guess
gonna
where this is? I'm embarrassing her. But she
yes.
didn't know where it was, and it's a place we go to very regularly.
It looks so vastly different. It looks like there's also construction going on there, which is different.
Yeah, that is true.
That was definitely what threw me off.
And it was hard to decide which photos to put up because we received so many photos from water reporters of places in the Casco Bay watershed that were unrecognizable due to the flooding. All right, so we are going to get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Sara Freshley, and I am the community organizer and volunteer coordinator for Friends of Casco Bay. And joining me this morning is Ivy Frignoka. She is Casco Bay's Casco Baykeeper. Good morning, Ivy.
Good morning, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our first virtual coffee shop. The tables are empty behind us because you're all joining us on Zoom. We're really glad and thankful that you're with us. And we're trying out this new format of doing programming where it's a little more conversational and we leave a lot more time to answer your questions. Back to you, Sarah.
We're going to start with going over where those two photos are from. So we'll put them back up on the slide here. So there were a lot of really good guesses in the chat. Photo number one, as many of you got, is in South Freeport. It's the Freeport Town Wharf. And if you have really good eyesight, you may have been able to see that it in fact does say Freeport Town Wharf, but the lighting isn't great. For those of you that are familiar with the area, usually the water level, I mean, this is truly a wharf and you have to walk down to the dock. And this is very high water. That's Hereseek at Lunch and Lobster right there on the right. And photo number two is in Bethel. Some of you got that. Bethel is at the very tippity top of the Casco Bay watershed. And as many of you know, they received a lot of flooding in these recent storms. And many folks at Sunday River were trapped because the road washed out for quite a few days, right, Ivy?
Yeah, so there were people trapped on the mountain, workers and guests, for over 2 days until they could get the road unflooded. And then the flooding that you see here extended all the way back to the backside of Mount Abram, which is like, I think through the woods is probably like 4 or 5 miles of flooding.
Something I want to point out too about that Bethel picture is that the wastewater treatment plant is flooded. And that is very relevant to what we're talking about this morning, which is stormwater. Ivy, to start off, can you talk a little bit about the weather this winter and how you've been liking it?
Um, it's really hard to talk about the weather. I know this is like the classic MENA way to greet one another. How's the weather for you?
Um,
But it's really hard to talk about the weather this winter and not have kind of an emotional response to the storms that we're having and the impact that they're having on our state and on people of our state and on the water resources that we all love and work to protect. So I have very mixed feelings about the weather. And I'm someone who still really loves winter and loves snow. And so it's hard to see these changes.
what we're talking about today is relevant. It's stormwater, and we have seen a lot of stormwater this winter, as Ivy's talking about. So I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page this morning. Ivy, can you just start out defining what stormwater is?
Yeah, I'm just define what stormwater runoff is because that's what's relevant to nation. So basically, and my apologies to the technical experts in the audience, but basically what we're talking about is any form of moisture that falls from the sky. Mostly it's heavy amounts because it's got to be enough to run off from the land into our waterways. So like heavy rains, snow melt, sleet, freezing rain, anything like that that then collects on the landscape and runs off.
What is stormwater pollution then?
That is what the stormwater picks up on its journey from the sky to our waterways. So, in part, it can be pollution that's in the air. And that's why our staff scientist, Mike Doan, always says, don't eat the snow. And then a lot from our perspective and what we work on and try to reduce, it's what the stormwater picks up from the landscape and carries to our waterways. And that could be um, say cow manure or fertilizers from farm fields. It could be fertilizers and pesticides from lawns. And it is increasingly um, any kind of pollution that is on our urbanized landscapes, like heavy metals, car exhaust, cigarette butts, pet waste, anything at all that is on our built surfaces that collects there and then runs off in the water.
Folks, if you have questions throughout this whole process, please put them in the chat. We will have plenty of time to answer your questions at the end. Ivy, how is this pollution and the stormwater runoff impacting Casco Bay?
Oh, well, we don't know all the ways. And one of the things that we're increasingly concerned about is um, the changing intensity of all these storms, like having so much rain fall so fast and run off into our waterways, and B, the changing seasonal patterns of these. So some of these storms are now these more intense rainstorms. We saw them in the winter of 2022, and we certainly saw three very big storms in December of 2022 and bleeding into January of 2023. So when you have these like really big, intense rain events instead of snow in the winter, everything is sheeting off ground that is completely frozen. So there isn't any place for the rainwater to really absorb in and percolate. So that is a change. What impact it's having on the bay? I'll pick two pollutants as an example. One of the pollutants that we know is delivered in fairly large loads to Casco Bay from stormwater is nitrogen pollution. And nitrogen in and of itself is a good thing. It helps fertilize the blooms that we need in the bay, both phytoplankton and algae, to support the food web and just be part of the natural cycle in a healthy estuary like Casco Bay. And when there's too much, then we have excessive blooms and it causes serious health problems in the bay. So that is one of our concerns. And last summer, because of the increased rainstorms, Heather and I actually did more monitoring at the stormwater outfalls along Back Cove. And we did see, both from those stormwater outfalls and the combined sewer outfalls, which we can talk about later, higher nitrogen levels. One of the other pollutants of concern is we were talking about these wintertime storms. Well, in the winter, salts are applied, chlorides are applied to our roads and our sidewalks and our parking lots to prevent slipping and falling. And that's laudable. That's, you don't want people to slip and fall and get hurt. But what happens with these intense rainstorms is that rushes off into all the freshwater streams and brooks around those parking lots and sidewalks and roads. And it turns them too salty. It makes them toxic for the aquatic life that they support. And it's very, very hard to restore them. So those are two of the major pollutants of concern, along with a whole host of other things, such as pesticides and heavy metals and things like that. And I see that a lot of people are commenting on PFAS. We will be doing another coffee program on PFAS. That is another issue we're working on.
As Casco Baykeeper, what are you currently focused on to address this huge problem?
So there's two major things we're working on in 2024. The first is many of you may have seen our articles or other communications about the permit that regulates separate storm source systems in the greater Portland area. It's known as the MS4 permit. I'm not going to get into it in a lot of detail. Please ask me questions if you need me to clarify it. But basically, that's a permit that's issued under the Clean Water Act. And the goal of the permit is to try to minimize the pollution that is coming out of these urbanized storm source systems that collect all the discharge from the roadways, carry it through pipes, and then discharge them into our waterways. And most of that permit has been implemented. There's one section left to be implemented, which we think will have a major impact, be a very helpful impact to reduce stormwater pollution. And that one last piece is a requirement that these urbanized municipalities adopt an ordinance that requires the use of what's known as low impact development techniques. And that is the Department of Environmental Protection is working on the elements that need to go into those ordinances right now. And that should be done early this year. Two things. One is low impact development. Basically, to oversimplify it again, is you're trying to protect how water naturally works and filters on the landscape, and you're trying to treat stormwater on site so that it doesn't run off and cause harm elsewhere. So it could be things as simple as using less paved surface, preserving a natural stream bed, planting a buffer zone with like rooted trees or shrubs between a parking lot and a stream, using vertical parking garages. So that's one of the two things we're working on. I'm going to pause there in case you have any question for me about that before I go into the second.
I don't. I think that was very clear. Thank you, Ivy. So
Okay.
that is the local level, the permits that we have been working on. How else as the Casco Baykeeper are you addressing this issue?
Sure. So that permit only regulates stormwater discharges from these urbanized municipalities. And there is a separate state law that regulates or manages stormwater, if you will. And under that law, there are rules that regulate large developments to manage stormwater. And those rules are known as Chapter 500, just for ease of reference. And the rules were written in 1979. They have been updated, but not a lot. And they're due for a major rewrite, both because they need to address climate change and because we know a lot more about stormwater and have a lot more built environments since that time. So the Department of Environmental Protection has convened a stakeholder group or a steering committee, and I'm fortunate enough to be on that. And we're working with the DEP to discuss how the rules should be updated.
Can you talk a little bit more about what in the rules you do want updated? I know you mentioned low impact development. Can you mention some other priorities?
Sure. So right now, the rule applies to development that has 1 acre or more of impervious cover. Translated, that is all the roofs, parking lots, blah, 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 things like that, that don't allow water to percolate into the landscape, or 5 acres of disturbed area. And according to a study from the University of New Hampshire, if we keep the threshold at that level, we're only capturing 30% of new development or treating impervious cover. If we reduce it to a threshold of 5,000 square feet, then we're capturing 80%
Wow.
of development and treating it. So I don't know what ultimately will be the number that will get put into main stormwater rules, but we will certainly be advocating for a lower threshold than what currently exists right now, because with the existing rules, we are not prevailing. Stormwater pollution is continues to increase. So that's one of the big areas that we're looking at. Second, the current rule tries to provide incentives for developers to use those low impact development techniques we talked about, but it doesn't require them to use it. And under the current set of incentives, the way that the rule is written, the developers are not choosing to use those techniques. And they may have good technical problems for that. I'm not saying it as a criticism, but from our perspective, this rule, like the ordinances in the MS4 permit, needs to require certain core elements of low impact development. And I do believe the department agrees. We just haven't seen the proposal yet of what those core elements will be that will be required for low impact development. I don't want to just keep talking on and on. I'm going to give you one more, well, actually 2 more examples, and then we can break it down or go on to whatever else you need to do. One discrete thing we'd like to see added to the rule is that right now the rule has a total phosphorus control sections for areas that are sensitive or impaired for phosphorus pollution. Phosphorus does to fresh water what nitrogen does to salt water. So phosphorus is the pollutant that will fertilize too much algal growth in fresh water. So we would like to see this rule address total nitrogen, and we'd like to see it do whatever it can to address chlorides, which is a huge and very, very difficult problem. And then the last thing that I'll say is, well, it's actually 2 more things I want to say, sorry. I'm going to try to make this quick. Redevelopment. There's a lot of past harm that exists from development that was done before we understood what we do about stormwater. So we'd love to see this rule do more to help treat stormwater from redevelopment, knowing that that's a really hard problem to tackle, but we should try. And then finally, climate change. You know, it used to be that things like floodplains were calculated on 100 years of past data. We can't do that anymore because storms are changing. So we really need to be forward thinking in how we're designing things, how we're thinking about a 5-year storm, a 25-year storm, etc. So those are like the big subjects that we're looking forward to discussing as part of this steering committee.
This is a process. You mentioned you're on the steering committee. What does the rest of the process look like to get these rules implemented into law? And how can the public and the people who are listening in this webinar get involved and get their voice heard?
Yeah, so right now, the steering committee and technical advisory committee are working with the department on the elements of the rule and having discussions about how it might be revised. And theoretically by June, although it's a tall task to be done that quickly, there will be a draft rule. And, you know, whenever a rule like this that makes such big changes is being proposed, it doesn't just automatically get implemented. There's a big public process. So the rule will be presented to the Board of Environmental Protection, and then there'll be a public comment process. So everyone here can track the rule and issue comments regarding the rule during that process. And we're hoping, Sara and I, to do a series of field trips through the spring and early summer to get out in the field with all of you and look at some of the implications of stormwater and make some of this a little more real than just our coffee shop dialogue.
Okay, great. And I know you mentioned our data briefly, and it is a little odd that we haven't talked about our scientific data more in a Friends of Casco Bay webinar. So just briefly, what stood out to you in our data in regards to stormwater this year?
So, again, if you follow our work, you know that we have maintained 3 continuous monitoring stations, one of which has been deployed for 8 years. And those stations sit about 3 or 4 meters down in the water column. When fresh water enters Casco Bay, it's less dense than salt water, so it usually floats on top. And that's why, like, if you're at East End Beach, for example, you can see a big a big brown plume of like storm water floating in from the Presumpscot River. Oh my God, maybe I shouldn't be having decaf this morning. Um, uh, because it's sitting on top. So one of the things that struck me was there was a storm in the summer that we saw a really big drop in salinity at our station on Cousins Island from the Royal River. And it lasted for a long time. And this is 3 or 4 meters down. Like, how much fresh water is that for that to occur? And then this winter with the storms, we also saw dips in salinity. And they weren't as big as what we saw in the summer, but any dip at 3 to 4 meters down really shows you that there's a lot of fresh water entering the bay. So it's something we need to pay attention to.
Is there anything else that you want to mention before we go into questions?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, let me speak a little more properly. So
We're casual.
a couple things. You know, I mentioned a little bit earlier combined sewer overflows, and just as a refresher, and again simplifying it, there are pipes that carry sewage water to a treatment plant. There's pipes that carry storm water that discharge directly into our waterways, and then there's these other pipes that are combined pipes and carry both storm and sewer water. And when it rains a lot and the amount of stormwater coming into the pipes exceeds the capacity of the pipes to carry all that water. And in those cases, there are places along our waterway where it's designed to let that water overflow into, it's normally like they're gated so that everything goes to the treatment plant. But when there's too much water, they overflow into our waterways. And that is particularly true in Back Cove and along the Fore River. So I was curious what this increase in stormwater, what impact that was having on these combined sewer overflows, because then it's not just stormwater pollution that's entering the bay, but it is untreated sewage water that's entering the bay. So looking back at the data from the last 5 years, the amount of combined sewer overflow that went into Casco Bay, or the tributaries that feed the bay, and this is just in Portland, this year was 373.6 million gallons. That's like a huge amount of untreated combined sewer overflow. So I went back 5 years, and the next highest year was 194.5 million gallons. And so this year almost doubled the amount of combined sewer overflows into the bay. I can't quantify for you the difference in pollutant load because those discharges didn't get monitored, but it can't be good, to double the load. And I think the other point that really struck me was Monday, I was at a meeting that the Department of Environmental Protection hosted to work on Chapter 500. And what the state had done was over a particular study period time, they had broken the state into watersheds, and they looked at those watersheds that were like the fastest growing, becoming the most urbanized, and so therefore were most threatened by stormwater pollution. And the top two were number one, the Four River watershed, and number two, coastal Casco Bay. So this problem and addressing stormwater pollution and trying to ensure that we reduce pollution is really, really important to the health of Casco Bay and our watershed.
Thank you, Ivy. And it's time to turn to participants' questions. So we cannot get to all of your questions, but not to worry, this is not the only stormwater content that you will have access to in the coming months. This webinar will be recorded and sent to all of our members, whether or not you registered or not. And you can always call us, email us with more questions as well. Ivy, are there steps that individuals can do to reduce stormwater pollution?
Yes. So you could participate in any program that reduces fertilizer and pesticide use on your property. You could plant vegetation along waterways or leave buffered zones along waterways that are on your property to help protect against runoff. You could use less salt on your driveway or no salt on your driveway and some sand. You could support ordinances and efforts in your towns and municipalities to promote low impact development. You can comment on these rules. There are many, many things that we can do. I just, actually, one of the examples that we saw in this meeting on Monday was there was a development that they showed from Massachusetts, and when they used the most modern, the most efficient stormwater management techniques, they could actually increase the amount of housing units on a lot, and decrease the amount of pollution. Wow. So I think if you're buying new property or developing property, you can ask questions that help to lead to controlling stormwater.
How is stormwater runoff treated exactly?
That's a difficult question. So there's it's difficult because it's hard to treat. It depends on the pollutant. So some of the things that happen are called like green infrastructure, and it's the things like leaving buffers, and others are gray infrastructure. It's stormwater treatment systems that are put in. Some of them you can see along the Back Cove Trail. Some of it in Portland during rain events are treatment plant, and I believe South Portland does this too. Fred is on the line. Fred can answer this in chat. Some of the stormwater is actually sent to the treatment plants, and they will at least remove the bacteria and process it. It doesn't go through the full everything that the wastewater goes through, but they at least treat it. And in Portland, there are the series of conduit and tanks along Back Cove that are capturing stormwater as part of the combined sewer overflows. And it's been interesting because I have been thinking about those conduits more, and thinking that they're probably an even better idea now than we originally thought, because in the winter when the ground is completely frozen, it's at least collecting the most polluted rain, combined sewer water, including the most polluted rainwater, and holding it there until such time as the treatment plant has capacity.
On a similar note, what is the impact of warmer weather? We're having warmer winters and shorter periods of snowpack and frozen ground. How is that changing the seasonal cycle of percolation? I know this is a complicated question, but you were just alluding to the impact of frozen ground.
Yeah, I'm really wrestling with this question with Sarah. You know this. We have our program team is our scientist Mike Doan, Heather, our science and policy associate Sara, and me. And we were talking about our data earlier this week, and we have a retreat where the four of us just go someplace very quiet and stare at our data for long periods of time and think about it. And there are a couple of things that we're really thinking about. First is that these intense storms on completely frozen ground and what's happening now that we're having these big rainwater events in the winter. How is that changing what's happening? The second thing we're thinking about is because we don't have the snowpack that's melting in the spring, normally that snow melt in the spring freshet, if you will, it would fertilize what's needed for like a big phytoplankton bloom at a time when the bay needs it to feed lots of juvenile organisms, and that is not happening anymore. So all of the shifts in what's happening and when we're seeing and documenting at our stations, like blooms in phytoplankton and everything, is really changing. So we don't know yet the impacts that that's totally having on the bay. I don't think anybody totally does, but that's one. And then you mentioned the warmer water, and that's another thing that's concerning because some of these pollutants like bacteria or nitrogen have more harmful effects in warmer water.
We talked about PFAS a little earlier, and we mentioned that our next coffee with the Casco Baykeeper is going to be focused on PFAS. So you'll get a lot more information about that. We are working in studying that right now. But are PFAS transported by stormwater? Is that a concern?
Yes, yes. And stay tuned. We did do 1 year of study at our all of our seasonal monitoring sites this year on PFAS levels in Casco Bay. That information is not publicly available yet, but it should be really soon, hopefully in the next week or two. And then we'll be doing a more detailed study in the next Coffee with the Baykeeper. We'll cover what our plans are and what that data showed.
What is the timeline for Chapter 500, the state rules, to be revised by?
The optimistic timeline is that the committee and the technical advisory group would finish its work by June, and then the rule adoption process would start in June, and the hope is that the rule would be adopted by the end of this year. That is a very ambitious timeline for a very, very complicated rule. Like it's not easy, but it's easier for me to say it should require LED and it could have to consider climate change. But then the technicalities of how that gets implemented and what the technical advisory committee group comes up with to implement that's a lot to digest.
I know we talked about it briefly, but can you talk about how folks in the webinar can comment and what that public comment period looks like and what the Board of Environmental Protection is looking for?
Yes. So just to kind of take a step back, I mentioned that when there's a rule of this significance, it doesn't just get adopted. I mean, there's always public process. And this type of rule is known as a major substantive rule. And again, translating that to simple terms, that means that it has to go through a formal adoption process before the Board of Environmental Protection, which is part of the Department of Environmental Protection. And during that, there will be public comment opportunities and opportunities to provide testimony. And we will be sharing information about that. So if you're on this list, you will get information. You will be told how you can sign up for notifications. Once the board is completed its process, it provisionally adopts the rule, but then it has to go to the legislature for approval. And so then there's a second opportunity for public comment and public process before the legislature. And then it goes back to, once the legislature approves it, it goes back to the Board of Environmental Protection to adopt. But it can be amended along the way. It can be disagreed with. It's not like just because something is done in June that that's ultimately what's going to be adopted.
What exactly is causing the overflow of stormwater and sewage into the bay? Is there a way to treat it once it's entered the bay?
Oh gosh. I have seen, I guess, or I should say, I'm aware of projects where kelp is being grown or oysters are being used to filter polluted water elsewhere. And they're not like oysters for harvest, like the high quality, shellfish farms that we have in Casco Bay that are in clean water. These are like in New York and New Jersey, they're literally using shellfish as filter feeders where they have huge volumes of combined sewer overflows. Our goal is to not let it get to the bay because you have like the solids and everything else that are getting in there. So our hope is to, like, we would just like to continue to work with the city to, build more conduits or do other things so that we're reducing the volume.
And what exactly is causing the overflow of the sewage into the bay?
It's what I was talking about. It's like, so if you have a pipe, think of it like if you have a drinking straw and there's like, there's a certain amount of liquid you could put through the drinking straw. And then if you pour like way too much, it's not going to fit through the straw. And well, with a straw, it's just going to come out at the top, right? It's not going to let you go in. But what happens with the combined sewer system is along the way, there's there's places where that excess can just be dumped right out into our waterways.
Great. Thank you so much, Ivy. That is all we have time for today. We do want to let you get on with your day and thank you for sharing your morning with us. As a reminder, we are planning on having 2 more Coffee with the Casco Baykeeper sessions, one on PFAS that we've talked about a little bit, and another one on eelgrass. So stay tuned. We have not scheduled them yet, but we will let you know as soon as we schedule those. Once again, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you all a link and you're welcome to reach out to us with any questions at any time. Ivy, do you want to say any final words?
Yes. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you all so much for caring. And I saw so many interesting points and comments in the chat. I hope we can capture that. There was a lot of great suggestions or good comments about this topic. And thank you. It's just always a pleasure to be with our people.
Thank you all so much. Happy Wednesday.
Bye.